What you're watching is a ceremony called Last Post. This is the Belgian city of Ypres, one of the main places where the First World War was fought. And we're here on our First World War travel course that takes place every other J term. At 8 o'clock every night since the 1920s, except for World War II, Belgian firefighters have gathered, traffic has been stopped, and people watch the firefighters play Last Post, which was what was played in Allied and British lines at the end of each day. When the soldiers would be counted and those who are missing, we'd realize that they were dead. And so this, you'll see they're surrounded by the names of those who died in the war. It's a really moving ceremony, and just one thing from our trip we wanted to bring you this week on Past and Presents. Last Post takes place under what's called Menengate. Menengate was inaugurated in 1927, 9 years after the end of World War I, as a memorial to about 55,000 missing British, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, South African Commonwealth soldiers who had fought in the battles of Ypres, defending the Allied positions outside the city, and were unidentified. It's designed by Sir Reginald Blomfield, who is one of the main war architects. You see his work all over the Western Front, including the Cross of Sacrifice that rises above every single British Commonwealth war cemetery. As the episode continues, we're going to take you to other sites around Ypres and around the Battle of the Somme, which was fought in 1916 by the British, French, and Germans. But let's start with our faculty conversation of the week. Well, students, welcome back to part 2 of a conversation that started last week between AnneMarie Kooistra and myself about how Christians engage in the practice of history. So to review from last week, was to a significant, I was going to say certain, but a significant extent, thinking historically and thinking Christianly about the past probably overlap a lot.
Yeah.
That, Christians are seeking truth, and I think using the rules of evidence that other historians use help us to get that truth. We started, though, to think about what difference faith would make, and talked about the way that the reality of sin or a belief in the Imago Dei would shape us. One way it could make it different that our friend George Marston suggested to dismiss is it could lead us to say, well, we view certain texts, for example, as having special authority. Christians believe in a set of Holy Scriptures as special revelation.
Yeah.
And you could, for example, write an article or a book in which you quote regularly from Scripture to support arguments you're making. You could, I mean, I've heard Mormon historians talk about the fact that that tradition has a deep sense of God revealing himself especially through continuing prophecy, Joseph Smith all the way up through the church hierarchy of today. You could appeal to that. So Mormon historians wrestle with that. Why should we not do that? I mean, if you do regard, let's assume we regard Scripture as authoritative and inspired and having, I mean, it's important to us, right?
It's very important.
So why would we set that off to the side when we're doing this other really important thing to us of studying the past?
Well, I think on the first gut reaction I have is that part of what motivates me to do the kind of work I do is so that I can be part of the larger discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And in my particular field, I don't see it overrun with Christians. So as soon as I'm starting to use biblical texts, I am going to be out of that discussion and completely discounted, and that is not something I want to do. So that's a very pragmatic rationale.
We talked about that, this access to the academy.
But the second thing too, it feels odd to use the Bible in writing a history, because the people I think of immediately are people like William Bradford, who coming to the shores of North America and seeing that in fact the Native American villages were decimated by disease, but they had left behind their corn and shelters.
Mm-hmm.
He saw this as an act of God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, clearly God's hand was at work, sweeping away the multitudes that he might make room for us. And I think I don't want to be in the position where 50 years from now, my grandchildren are looking back and going, wow, Grandma was really off in sort of suggesting that God's hand was evident in this or that fashion when, in fact, the facts do not seem to support that.
So this leads us really seamlessly into what Fia is mostly writing about this week, which is you could engage in a Christian practice of history, and frankly, a lot of Christian historians did this into the early 20th century, called providential history, where you are trying to read the hand of God at work, and you've got to balance a couple of things. So John suggests we Christians have some sense, at least, of providence, that God is not this deistic watchmaker up, but he's actively engaged. The Holy Spirit is at work. The church is doing the work.
Absolutely.
And yet, he says that in almost all settings, it would be inappropriate for a Christian historian to come to the interpretation you just described.
Well, and I think, too, it's also a matter of realizing that, you know, Christians are fallen, the church is fallen, and God doesn't just work in obvious ways. Sometimes God works, I believe, through tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, to be able to say with complete clarity that, oh, this is evidence that God is working versus this, I think God is working through everything.
Mm-hmm.
So to say this has some sort of special evidence versus that seems to discount then the other part of the history.
It often seems like the judgment of God in those interpretations aligns really closely with personal sense. I mean, your own worldview. I mean, I think if we haven't talked about the virtue of humility yet in history, this maybe is a good point to start. And this is, I think, one of John's responses. It's a profoundly unhumble way of approaching the past.
And I think it takes a lot of chutzpah on the part of a historian to be able to say, oh, I have probed the mystery of an omniscient and omnipotent God, and I can clearly tell you what is happening here. Yeah, I think you're displacing God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit there, and I think that's not a position I certainly want to be in.
Okay, let me give you a third distinctively Christian way. That this might be a little trickier, but we've talked about a conviction about the reality of sin might be a kind of control belief that would shape how we do history. Won't that then lead us occasionally to want to engage in moral judgment? If history is this act of interpretation, it's not just facts, we're actually making meaning of them. Aren't there moments where, for example, as a 20th century U.S. historian, you approach the treatment of Asian Americans in California, the treatment of African Americans in the Jim Crow system? Is it wrong for you to make a moral judgment at some point rather than just describing or analyzing?
It's not wrong to make a moral judgment because, again, I think historians are just doing that. Again, it's part of the interpretation. And I think there are times when, you know, again, though, it's important to be aware of your present bias and why you're seeing that as a moral judgment. And knowing, and to go back to the humility thing, knowing that very possibly you will be judged in 30 years as being, you know, like, whoa, you know, you were able to see that Jim Crow was a bad thing and that maybe the 1950s civil rights movement moved along too slowly. But you also have to be aware that, you know, you've got those logs in your own eye. And I think even as you're making the moral judgments, it's really important to do that with a sense of humility that you're not understanding the complete situation at the time. I mean, one of the things with regard to civil rights, okay, you've got some really great people out there pushing for more immediate end to various terrible practices, but it's really important to tell students, like, okay, the reason that the older generation is cautious is because they're afraid their kid's going to get killed. And so, don't judge the more gradualist folks too harshly without understanding, too, that it's important to get into their shoes and see things from their perspective as well.
Right. So not just humility, but desire for empathy might drive us towards
Indeed.
that kind of
It's
caution.
very important.
Right.
Yeah.
Students will say, I had no idea there was so much history in early American history. And I don't know if that's because of the way that it's taught in high school, if they don't get much exposure to it. But we use a lot of primary sources. We use a lot of scholarly articles. It's a great way to explore historiography. And I think, and this is probably true in other eras, but at least for me in early America, there's a clear historiographic trail that you can follow, and it's very instructive for students to see, for example, like the growth of the idea of the Atlantic world. We do a research project which students have found very rewarding. We use the Slave Voyages database, which is a database of tens of thousands of voyages, and they pick one and they trace that voyage from the beginning, the middle passage, and then where it ends up. It's a great class. I tell students I'm a closet colonialist. If I could go back and redo my graduate school career, I probably would seriously consider colonial American history or early American history.
We're just outside of Ypres in a small town called Langemarck. This is the site of one of the German military cemeteries in Belgium. About 44,000 German soldiers lie buried here, including about 7,000 whose remains are unidentified. Behind me you see a mass grave. In front of it is an inscription from the book of Isaiah. It says, I have called you by name and you were mine. It's a really fascinating cemetery. Just to get in here you cross over a moat, and it's meant to evoke crossing the river Styx of Greek mythology and descending to the dead. Notice that it's not much rises up from the ground. The gravestones are all flat. They're not headstones or crosses. They each have multiple names, or it says 4 unidentified German soldiers. The clusters of 3 volcanic crosses were added, I believe, after World War II. I'm staring actually at the one thing that was allowed to rise up above the horizon, a collection of 4 statues who are very abstract features. One represents the medics. He's not armed, and they're looking out over their fallen comrades. It's really a powerful place to visit, and just one of the hundreds of cemeteries in this part of Belgium and into northern France.
I'm Kent Gerber. I'm the digital library manager at Bethel University, of course.
And I'm Fletcher Warren. I'm a senior business, political science, and history student.
So we'll talk a little bit about how we work with the digital library, so what we do. And there are 3 major phases. So when we work with the things that we eventually put up on the website for people to search and discover, we have a digitization phase, we have a metadata phase, and we'll talk about that in a bit, and then a presentation or discovery phase. So Fletcher does a lot. We work a lot together. Fletcher does a lot of the work, and so we can start if you want to describe.
Yeah, I've been here 3 years. So the first step, I guess, is to select which projects we want to do, and Ken does most of that, working with Diana Magnuson over at the archive. It's usually projects that are significant to Bethel's history or to the denomination. So then once we've selected the project, we get the materials from the archive, and it's usually my job to assess what condition they're in, how old they are, how fragile or durable the paper is. Some of the materials we work with are bound, and so those need to be cut for scanning. So there's kind of a creative destruction element, I guess. You have to destroy in order to preserve some of these items. So once things are cut up and prepared for scanning, we run them through the scanner. That's our usual process for digitization. Some things are quite fragile and they need to be manually scanned on the flatbed. Other things are durable enough that we can actually use the auto feeder, which is an attachment that goes on top of the scanner and can auto feed documents through. It's much faster. For things that are really delicate, we have what's called a copy stand, which is a flat platform that has a vertical column on the back that we can attach a camera to. And then, so if something's very delicate and it can't be, pushed down against the scanner bed, that can be placed on that platform and then photographed. And we've done that for a number of objects. Some of them were fragile books, others were artwork from the permanent art collection. I counted up actually a few weeks ago for a resume actually how many items I had particularly done, and I think not including some of the things that we've sent out for commercial scanning, I think it was well over 200,000 pages of individual material in my time here.
So after digitization, so we do what's called metadata. So I'm sure you're familiar with, everybody's done something where you've loaded something into iTunes, or if you use Facebook, you've tagged things. So what we do is we just do a little bit more tagging. So we use standards, sometimes national, sometimes international standards, but something would be, you describe the title, you describe what the object's about, who made it. And so we put all that metadata we connect the image that we've scanned with this image in the data so that you can find it on Google, or so you can search it on different websites where we present it. And there's also some metadata that we include. So if it's not just an image, if it's multiple pages, we have to include metadata, which brings all those items together. So that's how, if you're reading an ebook, metadata is what actually makes sure those images hold together and so that they stay together. So metadata is a way of sort of administering, describing the stuff that we're scanning. And we also treat anything that's already digitized with metadata. So if it hasn't been digitized, that's where it starts. One other thing about metadata is we try to anticipate how people might be looking or using it. So, and we want people to be able to find it through Google or find it through the website.
A lot of what I do is, after the digitization has happened, then it's the metadata process, which kind of talked about. All of that data goes into spreadsheets, which once they're complete, get loaded into some of our software on the back end, and then the items are uploaded to our website, where they can be viewed, downloaded, in a lot of cases, searched, a lot of different things like that. So that's kind of the public presentation piece of what we do here.
And that's part of the sort of the exhibit stage. We really want people to understand the context of the collections. We want to know, what are they, what's important about them, why are they significant? And so putting them together too also communicates what's important about them. So if the Clarion collection is all together, or the art collection, or different historical artifacts.
Sure. Yeah. And just to give an example of how some of the metadata that we've done on the back end can contribute to the presentation and using some of these items in a productive kind of way. If you go to really any of our items, for example, maybe an issue of the Standard, which is the Bethel's denominations publication, we've got all of the article authors tagged in the metadata. And so you can go down into the website and actually click on any of those names, and it will pull up a new search, which pulls together all of the articles that person has written. And that might be a span of 15 or 20 years, but it's a really handy way to pull together everything that you might be looking for.
And then that's the level where we use standards, national and international. So not only can we pull them together in that one collection, if we use an international standard or a national standard, we can actually pull together wherever that author has appeared anywhere in the universe of scholarship, whether it's an article, whether it's an image, or anywhere on the web. We certainly are accepting applications. On the library website, on the employment section, you can apply, and we look at applications, and especially there are all sorts of skills. So if you have technical skills are helpful, but an interest in history, an interest in culture, art. Fletcher also is modest, but he also has a great aesthetic eye. Like he has some of the design on the website, like the icons and the headers that we use, he's designed them, and so he's been able to use some of his graphic aesthetic talent too. So design, if you work with spreadsheets, if you have detail oriented, if you're interested in history and you want to get your hands on those materials and sometimes cut them apart. we use duplicates. We don't get rid of the originals. Sure. But there's all sorts of ways that, so talents and interests and skills, but apply on the library website or come talk to me.
I looked for an internship just to kind of give me some more views of different areas and aspects of museums, and just even looking at living history versus the Minnesota Historical Society, and seeing just if there was an area that I could find my niche in, or just things I was passionate about that I didn't realize. And so I ended up working with Item Homestead, which is a living history museum. It's set on a farm between 1890 and 1910, which I chose that one. There were very few various ones. I could be working with an archives at the downtown Central Library and their special collections, but this one just was more appealing just because it was something I hadn't encountered, and I thought it was good to explore that a bit too. I loved the staff, and so getting ready for our Spring on the Farm event was just really fun, even though just planning everything from the Doug Oman photo presentation of his historic barns, but also just planning flowers and planting herbs for the kids, and just very tangible, physical tasks I was given. I really liked that, and having deadlines and meeting those. But just getting to work on that with the staff there was really enjoyable.
So we've moved on to northern France. We're near a river called the Somme, which was the site of one of the worst battles of World War I. On July 1st, 1916, British and Commonwealth troops went over the top and attacked German positions. By the end of the day, 20,000 were dead and twice as many were wounded. And the battle continued until November. We're standing in preserved trenches. You see that these wouldn't have been good for someone who's 6'3". The average soldier was about 5.5 feet at the time. If you look down over the whole system, you see how complicated it is, and you'll see no man's land. There's a British battlefield cemetery off to my left. About 400 meters away was the target, the German trenches by the tree line, and you see a Scottish statue down there, a Highlander. That's where the British finally reached their position in November of 1916, and then winter halted the battle, and in 1918 they lost it all again.
So, AnneMarie, let me pick up from the theme of moral judgment and give you something I've at least heard Tracy McKenzie say, and I can't remember if he talks about in First Thanksgiving. He suggests moral judgment in the sense of you got some kind of authority as a historian then to issue a ruling on something be in or out of moral bounds. That maybe is something to be cautious about, but one thing we shouldn't be too hesitant to engage in is what he calls moral reflection. Mm-hmm. That rather than using the vantage point of the historian to issue a judgment on a group of people for their moral blind spots, maybe it causes you to use history as a mirror and to think about where your own shortcomings. Is that something you're maybe a little bit more comfortable with? Do you see
I'm
problems
probably
with
more
that
comfortable.
As well?
I think that's probably all right. And I think especially, again, as I think about, we still deal with problems of prostitution and vice and how to regulate crime or how to, deal with criminals. And I think understanding the conditions that made prostitution prevalent in the late 19th century and then looking at what has changed, what's the same, to what degree are we not just dealing with this group of people, but to what degree am I implicated in these things? I think that is a good thing to think about. Same with civil rights, same with any of these things.
Yeah, and I think it maybe then leads us to our final topic, which is the purpose of us engaging in history, especially at a place like this, is not simply to produce books and articles, but it's a teaching calling, and it's a learning calling for students, and we'll say more about calling at the end of this webisode series. And it gets us to one of John Fia's arguments, is that the purpose of history is, in part, personal, right? Yeah. It actually produces some effect. Like studying the past within this discipline actually shapes you and informs you. It makes you more humble, we've talked about.
Right.
It might make you more loving of neighbors, possibly. So even suggests it could be conversional.
Yeah.
It could bring about some significant changes. And at Bethel, we talked about transformative education. Right. Is that overreaching? I mean, do you see this happening? Is conversional too strong a word to use here?
I think that if you understand conversion as a process, I think that works. I don't think you can understand it as it's going to be something that happens overnight. Maybe for some people it will, but I think it's it's the slow burn. It's the slow burn where something is simmering and something is moving and it's causing you to think differently, but it's not going to happen just in a split second. It's going to happen with each successive class. It's going to happen with each successive book or article that you read, and you're going to be going, this is, I used to think this, but I'm wondering if I'm thinking something else now, and it has this impact on even how I see myself.
I think we have to approach, at least as professors, developmentally too.
Yeah.
I think I guess I expect to see this happening more in junior and senior level courses. It's a really difficult thing to do when you're 18 and it's your first time you're being asked to empathize deeply with people you might consider horrific in some respect. But I think empathy is really important here, because if you really take it seriously, you're leaving yourself open to connecting, entering with the mind of someone who views the world very differently from yourself. And one thing that Fia wrestles with is, can you do that if you don't leave open the possibility you will turn, you will change, you'll be converted as a result of it.
And I, as I've said to my students, even in a class last week, I said, the thing is, there is a sense sometimes of futility because, everybody's going to just stay the same. But the thing is, learning history does make you aware of, while there's a lot of resistance to change, even as Christians, you have to believe that people can change, because that's the third part of the creation fall redemption paradigm. Redemption implies that people, in fact, can change. Right. So I think, your world kind of comes crashing down on you when you are exposed to certain subjects, but then you do that with the hope of later transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think if change over time is one of those kind of staples of historical thinking,
Right.
it should suggest,
Right.
Not to say everything needs to change, but
Right.
you should be open to it and sensitive to the ways that this has happened in the church. It's happened beyond
Right.
the church. Yeah.
And, change can happen when you ask questions, when
Mhm.
you are willing, through empathy, to stand in somebody else's shoes. And it's much easier to do that when you're actually reading the words from the people themselves or seeing the world as they photographed it. And I think that's why history is such this beautiful tool of connection.
So we're agreed. History is awesome.
Yes,
Our
history
work
is
here
awesome.
is done.
Indeed.
We've moved a few kilometers down the Western Front. We're still on the former battleground of the Somme, and this is the great British memorial to the missing of the Somme outside the tiny village of Thiepval, designed by Sir Edward Lutyens, who's also the designer of the Cenotaph, which is the memorial right by 10 Downing Street in the House of Parliament that we visit very early in the trip. Something like 70,000 names are inscribed here, and then there's a small cemetery on the other side with 300 French and 300 British buried as well. It's really a monumental site. This really dwarfs Menin Gate, which is where we started this episode. Thanks for joining us on this little snippet of our World War I tour. If you're interested in the class, it'll be going again in January of 2017. In any case, we'll see you next week on Past and Presents.
Black baby.